They didn't just betray their faith, they hunted the people who trusted them. These are the preachers who used the pulpit as a weapon. Millions trusted them as spiritual leaders, but behind closed doors, they were hiding crimes darker than anyone imagined. Tonight, we expose pastors who used faith as their greatest weapon. Jim Jones, the founder of the People's Temple, was a man whose charisma, intellect, and fervent belief in social justice initially drew thousands to his church. Born in 1931 in Indiana, Jones was a complex figure, a young preacher with radical ideas about racial integration and equality, yet already exhibiting signs of extreme control and manipulation. By the late 1960s, his congregation had grown into a national phenomenon, attracting devoted followers eager to escape social inequality and embrace his promises of a utopian, God-centered community. Jones' early sermons focused on inclusion, social justice, and communal living. He preached against racism, poverty, and inequality, messages that resonated in an era of civil unrest. Congregants were drawn not only to his ideals but to his ability to make every individual feel noticed and loved. He promised a spiritual family in a world often indifferent to them. But behind his visionary persona lurked a darker impulse, an obsession with absolute authority, complete obedience, and control over every aspect of his followers' lives. By the mid-1970s, Jones had relocated his followers to Jonestown, a remote settlement in Guyana. He painted it as a paradise, a socialist utopia where racial harmony, communal living, and spiritual purity could flourish. In reality, Jonestown became a site of psychological manipulation, intimidation, and terror. Residents were subjected to constant surveillance, strict labor requirements, and the systematic erosion of personal autonomy. Any dissent was met with humiliation, punishment, or threats of exile, and Jones made it clear that leaving the community was unthinkable, even deadly. Jones cultivated loyalty through fear and emotional control. He staged mock executions, forced followers to denounce each other, and manipulated their sense of morality, spirituality, and fear of divine punishment. He positioned himself as a savior figure, convincing followers that the outside world was hostile and that salvation required total adherence to his commands. Letters from concerned relatives and outsiders were intercepted or destroyed, isolating residents further and reinforcing the cult's insular reality. Financial exploitation was rampant. Jones demanded contributions from his congregation, often taking their savings, properties, and possessions to sustain Jonestown. His leadership blended religious authority with socialist ideals, creating a system where followers believed that surrendering personal wealth was both morally necessary and spiritually rewarding. The combination of ideological persuasion and manipulative control made resistance nearly impossible. By 1978, external scrutiny intensified. Reports of abuse, forced labor, and human rights violations in Jonestown reached the U.S. State Department. Investigative journalist inquiries and congressional attention put Jones on edge. He feared exposure, believing it threatened the sanctity of his utopia. On November 18, 1978, the situation reached a catastrophic climax. When Congressman Leo Ryan visited Jonestown to investigate allegations of abuse, he was ambushed at the nearby airstrip by armed cult members as he attempted to leave with defectors. Ryan and 4 others were murdered. In the aftermath, Jones orchestrated what he called a revolutionary act, the mass ingestion of cyanide-laced punch by over 900 residents, including children. Those who resisted were forced or killed. This event became known as the Jonestown Massacre, the largest single loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until September 11, 2001. The aftermath shocked the world. Survivors were traumatized, families were decimated, and global media struggled to comprehend how faith, devotion, and charisma could be weaponized into such mass murder. Investigations revealed decades of psychological manipulation, financial exploitation, and the deadly consequences of unchecked authority. Jim Jones' story is a stark reminder of the dangers inherent in absolute power. It demonstrates how charisma, combined with ideological fervor and psychological control, can lead to exploitation, criminality, and ultimately, catastrophic violence. When devotion turns to obedience, and a leader becomes above law and morality, the consequences can be unimaginable. In Jonestown, faith was weaponized and more than 900 lives paid the ultimate price. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. Charles Manson was a man who captured the darkest corners of American fascination with cults, charisma, and criminality. Born in 1934 in Cincinnati, Ohio, Manson's early life was marked by instability, neglect, and brushes with the law. His mother, often absent or unable to care for him properly, left him exposed to a world of petty crime and survival on the margins. From a young age, Manson exhibited an intense, magnetic personality, capable of drawing others into his orbit with a combination of charm, menace, and psychological manipulation. By the late 1960s, Manson had relocated to California, drawn to the countercultural currents of the era. He gathered a group of followers, later known as the Manson family, primarily young women seeking love, belonging, or meaning. These individuals were vulnerable, searching for purpose, and Manson provided a dangerous mixture of affection, spiritual rhetoric, and ideological indoctrination. He claimed to be a prophet, a messianic figure, and the harbinger of a coming racial apocalypse he called Helter Skelter, a vision he claimed came from interpreting the Beatles' music as coded instructions for the end times. Manson's control over his followers was absolute. He isolated them from outside influences, dictated behavior, and enforced a strict hierarchy in which he was the unquestioned authority. Emotional manipulation was central to his power. He combined love bombing, verbal abuse, and threats of spiritual and physical consequences to maintain obedience. He introduced his followers to drugs, particularly LSD, to break down psychological resistance and create dependency on his guidance. Gradually, the group's sense of morality and legality was reshaped according to Manson's distorted worldview. The crimes began in earnest in 1969. Manson directed his followers to commit a series of brutal murders, including the infamous killing of actress Sharon Tate and several others in Los Angeles. The acts were premeditated, meticulously planned, and executed with shocking cruelty. Manson himself did not always commit the killings physically, but his influence was the force behind the violence. He framed these murders as a necessary step in sparking the race war he had predicted, convincing his followers that participation was both righteous and unavoidable. Investigations quickly traced the crimes back to the family. Law enforcement discovered a web of manipulation, coercion, and psychological control that made Manson the architect of terror. His ability to incite others to commit murder demonstrated the terrifying potential of charisma when combined with ideology and control. Witnesses and former followers described the psychological pressure, isolation, and fear that compelled obedience. Many were initially shocked by the crimes themselves, only later realizing the depth of manipulation that had led them to participate in or support his actions. The trial captivated the nation. Manson and several of his followers were charged with multiple counts of murder and conspiracy. The courtroom became a theater of spectacle, with Manson displaying erratic behavior, reciting his apocalyptic visions, and asserting a form of spiritual authority, even in the face of evidence. In 1971, Manson and several of his followers were convicted and sentenced to death, later commuted to life imprisonment after California's temporary abolition of the death penalty. Manson spent the remainder of his life in prison, maintaining a perverse form of celebrity infamy. The public remained fascinated and horrified, struggling to understand how a small group of impressionable individuals could commit such atrocities under the guidance of a single manipulative figure. Scholars and psychologists studied Manson extensively, using the case to explore cult dynamics, coercion, and the psychological mechanisms that allow charismatic individuals to exploit devotion and belief. The aftermath left a lasting mark on American culture. Families of victims were devastated, communities were traumatized, and the nation grappled with questions about the allure of charismatic leaders, the susceptibility of the young and vulnerable, and the capacity for ideology to be weaponized into extreme violence. Manson's life became a cautionary tale of criminality, masked by charm, and devotion twisted into obedience that led to murder. The story of Charles Manson highlights the intersection of charisma, ideology, and exploitation. It demonstrates how a leader can manipulate belief, control behavior, and incite crimes that shock the conscience. Manson's legacy is not only the horror of the murders he orchestrated, but the insight into human vulnerability, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the chilling consequences when devotion becomes subservience to a criminal mind. When a leader convinces others to commit unspeakable acts in the name of prophecy, belief, or belonging, it forces us to question how devotion can be manipulated and how blind trust can lead to tragedy. In Manson's world, faith in a person became a weapon, and the cost was death, fear, and a nation forever scarred. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. David Koresh, born Vernon Wayne Howell in 1959 in Houston, Texas, became one of the most infamous cult leaders in American history. From a young age, Koresh exhibited intense charisma, a commanding presence, and a fascination with religious texts that would later define his rise to power. He grew up in a turbulent household, experiencing instability, exposure to drugs and crime, and early brushes with authority. These experiences shaped a man who craved control, admiration, and spiritual significance, traits he would later exploit in the creation of a religious following that became deadly. Koresh's defining moment came when he joined the Branch Davidians, an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. This group, originally led by Lois Roden, was relatively obscure, emphasizing biblical prophecy, strict moral codes, and apocalyptic teachings. Koresh quickly distinguished himself with his knowledge of Scripture, particularly the books of Daniel and Revelation. He presented himself as a prophet capable of interpreting the Bible with divine insight, particularly regarding the end times. His ability to convince others that he had exclusive access to God's will attracted devoted followers and eventually allowed him to seize control of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas. Once in power, Koresh implemented strict rules governing every aspect of life at Mount Carmel, the compound where his followers lived. Daily routines, diets, work, and spiritual practices were all dictated by him. Members were encouraged to surrender personal autonomy, wealth, and possessions, with Koresh positioning himself as the sole intermediary between God and his followers. Children, adults, and even extended family members were subject to psychological manipulation, including intense study of Scripture, isolation from outside influences, and the constant reinforcement of Koresh's divine authority. He used fear, love, and charisma to create a system in which questioning his teachings was not only discouraged, but framed as spiritual failure. Koresh also cultivated a sexualized hierarchy within the group. He claimed that he had the right to take multiple spiritual wives, including underage girls, asserting that these relationships were divinely mandated. Members were told that obedience to Koresh's commands, including sexual compliance, was essential for salvation in the coming apocalypse. While some followers accepted these claims as acts of faith, others later revealed that coercion, fear, and psychological pressure were central to compliance. Koresh's teachings blurred morality and religious doctrine in ways that made resistance psychologically and socially untenable, ensuring his dominance over the group. Financial and material control were equally central to his power. Followers were expected to donate money, property, and personal assets to the compound. Koresh maintained tight control over finances and resources, reinforcing dependence and loyalty. Those who hesitated or questioned his authority were subjected to public criticism, ostracism, or threats framed as divine punishment. Koresh's control extended to communication. He limited access to the outside world, discouraged independent thought, and monitored interpersonal relationships, creating an insular environment that reinforced obedience. The escalation to criminal activity began subtly but grew increasingly dangerous. Koresh stockpiled weapons, asserting that the coming apocalypse required preparation and defense. He trained followers in paramilitary tactics and instilled a belief that external authorities, particularly the US government, were agents of evil conspiring to destroy them. By cultivating paranoia alongside religious devotion, Koresh primed his followers for conflict, ensuring that dissent or escape would be interpreted as betrayal against God and the community. This tension reached a critical point in 1993 when the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms (ATF) launched a raid on Mount Carmel, suspecting illegal weapons possession. The operation quickly escalated into a violent confrontation. Koresh and his followers resisted, and the resulting gunfight left 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians dead. The incident triggered a 51-day siege by the FBI, during which Koresh continued to preach, assert his authority, and maintain control over his followers. Negotiations, psychological tactics, and media coverage all failed to resolve the standoff peacefully. Koresh's ability to manipulate both his followers and external authorities prolonged the siege and heightened the tragedy that followed. Throughout the standoff, Koresh used his religious teachings to maintain compliance. He emphasized prophetic destiny, the imminence of Armageddon, and the necessity of ultimate sacrifice. Followers were told that death could be a passage to salvation, and that surrender to the outside world would bring eternal damnation. Children were kept within the compound, often shielded from reality, but simultaneously indoctrinated with apocalyptic ideology. The psychological manipulation was profound. Individuals were convinced that the path Koresh dictated, even if it led to death, was divinely sanctioned. On April 19, 1993, the siege ended in catastrophe. Following a fire whose origins remained debated, Mount Carmel was engulfed in flames. Koresh and 75 of his followers, including 25 children, perished. The fire destroyed the compound and left survivors traumatized, their families mourning not only their loved ones but the manipulation that had drawn them into such fatal devotion. Investigations revealed the depth of control Koresh had exercised over every aspect of life at Mount Carmel, from finances to sexual conduct, spiritual teaching, and psychological coercion. The tragedy exposed vulnerabilities in law enforcement approaches to cults, the dangers of extreme ideological manipulation, and the devastating consequences of charismatic authority unchecked by accountability. The aftermath of the Waco siege had a profound cultural impact. Scholars, journalists, and law enforcement studied Koresh's techniques to understand the mechanics of cult influence, including psychological coercion, isolation, and indoctrination. Survivors recounted experiences of manipulation, fear, and devotion that revealed the complex dynamics of power within cults. Families struggled with guilt, anger, and trauma, questioning how someone could exploit faith and trust to such deadly effect. The incident also fueled anti-government sentiment among some extremist groups, who cited the siege as evidence of tyranny, further complicating Koresh's legacy. David Koresh's story demonstrates how a charismatic leader can manipulate ideology, fear, and belief to exert complete control over a community, transforming devotion into exploitation and ultimately criminality. The Waco tragedy remains a cautionary tale of the lethal potential of unchecked religious authority. It highlights the vulnerability of those seeking meaning, belonging, and spiritual guidance, showing how a powerful personality can twist faith into obedience that culminates in crime, tragedy, and mass death. When spiritual devotion becomes submission to one individual's authority, and belief is weaponized to control thought, action, and morality, the consequences can be catastrophic. David Koresh's life and death challenge us to consider the fine line between faith and manipulation, between guidance and coercion, and between trust and the perilous surrender of autonomy. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. Shoko Asahara, born Chizo Matsumoto in 1955 in Yatsushiro, Japan, would become one of the most infamous cult leaders in modern history, orchestrating acts of terror that shocked the world. From a young age, Asahara displayed ambition, intelligence, and a fascination with spirituality, but also a controlling, manipulative streak. Blind in one eye and visually impaired in the other, he overcame personal adversity to create a powerful presence, projecting himself as both physically and spiritually formidable. His charisma, combined with an intense study of religion, mysticism, and apocalyptic prophecy, allowed him to gather followers willing to obey him without question. Asahara founded the religious movement Om Shinrikyo in 1984. The cult combined elements of Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and apocalyptic prophecy, with Asahara presenting himself as a living Christ and the only person capable of guiding humanity through the impending Armageddon. He promised spiritual enlightenment, personal transformation, and escape from the chaos of the modern world. Vulnerable individuals, including educated young professionals and university students, were drawn to his teachings, believing that he offered a path to ultimate knowledge and salvation. Once inside the cult, followers were subjected to intense psychological manipulation. Daily routines included long hours of meditation, rigorous study of Asahara's writings, and indoctrination into apocalyptic ideology. Obedience was demanded, dissent was punished, and fear of divine retribution was instilled at every turn. Asahara used a combination of affection, intimidation, and spiritual authority to maintain absolute control. Many followers reported being psychologically coerced into surrendering their possessions, cutting ties with families, and devoting their entire lives to the organization. Asahara's ambition, however, extended far beyond spiritual leadership. He began stockpiling weapons, developing chemical and biological capabilities, and orchestrating crimes to consolidate power and intimidate outsiders. The cult's activities escalated into violence, including assassination attempts on former members and critics, as well as clandestine production of illegal weapons. Asahara's control was such that followers willingly participated in criminal activity, believing they were fulfilling divine commands or securing the future of humanity under his guidance. The world became horrified by Asahara's crimes on March 20, 1995, when members of Aum Shinrikyo carried out a sarin gas attack on the Tokyo subway system. The attack killed 13 people, injured over 1,000, and caused mass panic throughout the city. This act of terrorism demonstrated the terrifying consequences of combining absolute religious authority with ideological extremism and access to lethal means. Investigations revealed a pattern of calculated deception, coercion, and manipulation, highlighting Asahara's ability to exploit faith for personal power and criminal intent. Law enforcement and judicial proceedings exposed the full scope of Asahara's criminality. He was found to have ordered multiple murders, including those of dissenting members, journalists, and even his own followers who posed a threat to his authority. The cult maintained a sophisticated network of surveillance, intimidation, and indoctrination, ensuring loyalty and minimizing the chance of defection. Asahara's crimes were both systemic and deeply personal, reflecting a leader who viewed human life as secondary to his ideological and spiritual ambitions. Asahara was arrested in 1995 and subsequently tried for multiple counts of murder, terrorism, and crimes against humanity. The Japanese judicial system painstakingly documented the cult's inner workings, revealing the extent of psychological and social control exerted over followers. In 2004, Asahara was executed, marking the end of his direct influence but leaving a lasting legacy of trauma, fear, and reflection for Japanese society. The aftermath of Aum Shinrikyo's crimes had profound social and cultural repercussions. Survivors and the families of victims struggled with emotional and psychological trauma. The attack shattered public trust in religious organizations and prompted stricter regulation of cult activities in Japan. Scholars analyzed the psychological mechanisms by which Asahara controlled his followers, from indoctrination and fear to the strategic use of ideology to justify criminal acts. The cult's structure and Asahara's methods became case studies in both criminology and psychology, illustrating the lethal potential of charismatic authority combined with apocalyptic obsession. Asahara's story is a chilling example of how spiritual authority can be weaponized. He leveraged religious ideology to exploit trust, manipulate belief, and orchestrate crimes that caused death and suffering on a massive scale. His followers' devotion, once a source of personal and spiritual identity, became a tool for exploitation and murder, highlighting the dangerous intersection of faith, power, and criminal intent. When someone claims divine authority, commands loyalty without question, and justifies violence as a pathway to salvation, faith becomes a weapon. Shoko Asahara's life forces us to confront the terrifying consequences of devotion, manipulated by a leader who sees obedience as more important than morality, and ideology as more powerful than human life. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. Marshall Applewhite, born in 1931 in Texas, emerged as a man whose intelligence, charm, and charisma would ultimately lead hundreds into tragedy. A trained musician and teacher, Applewhite was deeply interested in spirituality, mysticism, and alternative religious thought. His early life was marked by ambition and intellectual curiosity, but also by emotional instability and a search for meaning that made him susceptible to visionary and apocalyptic thinking. He struggled with personal identity and purpose, seeking a spiritual path that would reconcile his doubts, fears, and aspirations. In the early 1970s, Applewhite met Bonnie Nettles, a nurse and fellow seeker of spiritual truth. The two formed a profound partnership, blending their visions into a new religious movement they would eventually call Heaven's Gate. Applewhite and Nettles taught that humanity was destined to evolve into a higher form of existence, transcending the material world to join extraterrestrial life. This ideology combined Christian imagery, New Age concepts, and elements of science fiction, creating a belief system that promised both spiritual enlightenment and escape from earthly limitations. Followers were attracted to the movement by its promise of purpose, community, and transcendence. Applewhite's control over his followers was absolute. Members were isolated from their families, encouraged to sever ties with outsiders, and instructed to devote their entire lives to the teachings of Heaven's Gate. Daily routines were rigid, emphasizing discipline, meditation, and study of Applewhite's teachings. Personal autonomy was minimized. Followers relied on Applewhite and Nettles for guidance in nearly every aspect of life, from diet and clothing to social interactions and spiritual practice. The psychological influence they exerted created a dependency that allowed ideas, no matter how extreme, to be accepted without question. Financial exploitation and material control were also central to Applewhite's authority. Followers contributed savings, property, and income to support the community, which was presented as a necessary sacrifice for spiritual advancement. Applewhite's teachings framed these contributions as both morally and spiritually obligatory, reinforcing obedience while consolidating the movement's resources under his control. Members who hesitated or questioned directives were subject to moral censure or social exclusion, amplifying fear and compliance. The criminal and tragic culmination of Applewhite's influence occurred in 1997, believing that the earth was about to be recycled, and that only by leaving their physical bodies could they join a higher, extraterrestrial existence could his followers be saved. Applewhite directed a mass suicide at a rented mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California. Over the course of several days, 39 followers, dressed uniformly and following meticulous ritual, ingested lethal doses of phenobarbital mixed with vodka, wearing masks and preparing their bodies as if boarding a spacecraft. Applewhite himself perished alongside them. The preparation for this event revealed the extent of Applewhite's control. Followers had surrendered completely, emotionally, socially, and physically. They meticulously recorded their intentions, coordinated timing, and accepted death as the ultimate spiritual step. Families and friends were left stunned, struggling to comprehend how devotion to a charismatic leader could culminate in such organized self-destruction. Investigations documented Applewhite's manipulation, revealing psychological conditioning, isolation from reality, and ideological reinforcement that made questioning impossible. Heaven's Gate represents a unique combination of cult dynamics, extreme devotion, intellectual manipulation, and apocalyptic belief. Applewhite's leadership exemplified how a charismatic authority figure could leverage hope, fear, and ideology to exert total control, culminating in criminally negligent acts that resulted in the voluntary deaths of dozens. The tragedy illustrates the lethal potential of psychological manipulation under the guise of spiritual guidance, demonstrating how faith and obedience can be weaponized when concentrated in the hands of a manipulative leader. The aftermath left an enduring impact. Scholars, psychologists, and law enforcement studied Heaven's Gate as a case of extreme cult influence and criminally consequential obedience. Families grieved, communities struggled to process the event, and public awareness of the dangers of apocalyptic cults increased. The story also sparked debate about free will, consent, and the responsibility of leaders who exploit belief systems for ultimate control over life and death decisions. Applewhite's life serves as a haunting example of how charisma, ideology, and psychological control can converge to create tragedy. By promising salvation, transcendence, and escape from existential fear, he transformed followers' devotion into obedience that ended in death, leaving behind a cautionary tale about the intersection of faith, power, and criminal responsibility. When trust, hope, and devotion are concentrated in a single individual who presents himself as the gateway to salvation, the consequences can be catastrophic. Marshall Applewhite's story forces us to confront the frightening reality that spiritual guidance, when manipulated by ego and ideology, can become a path to destruction. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. Keith Raniere, born in 1960 in Brooklyn, New York, would go on to become the mastermind behind one of the most notorious and insidious cults of the 21st century. Known publicly as the founder of NXIVM, a self-help organization that promised personal growth, empowerment, and professional success, Raniere privately built a web of manipulation, exploitation, and criminality. From an early age, Raniere exhibited intelligence, ambition, and a desire for control, traits that would later allow him to dominate followers psychologically and financially. Raniere's public persona as a motivational speaker and entrepreneur drew in countless individuals seeking self-improvement, NXIVM presented itself as a legitimate program offering courses, seminars, and workshops aimed at fostering leadership, confidence, and emotional wellness. The organization attracted wealthy, educated, and professional individuals, particularly women, who were drawn to Raniere's charisma, intellectual rigor, and promises of unlocking human potential. To outsiders, NXIVM seemed innovative, empowering, and structured around positive personal transformation. However, beneath this veneer of legitimacy lay a system designed for total control and exploitation. Raniere established an inner circle known as DOS, an acronym that followers were told signified the vow, a secretive subgroup where women were subjected to extreme manipulation. Raniere demanded absolute loyalty and secrecy, enforcing obedience through psychological coercion, fear, and social pressure. Members were isolated from friends and family, monitored closely, and subjected to intense scrutiny. The combination of ideology, emotional manipulation, and hierarchical control created a dynamic in which questioning or resistance was nearly impossible. One of the most horrific aspects of Raniere's scheme was the systemic sexual exploitation of women. Members of DOS were coerced into providing collateral, compromising personal information, explicit images, or damaging confessions, which Raniere used to maintain leverage and enforce compliance. Women were also manipulated into sexual relationships with Raniere under the guise of empowerment or spiritual duty. This combination of coercion, secrecy, and ideological justification allowed him to exploit the vulnerability and trust of followers while maintaining a facade of mentorship and guidance. Financial control was another pillar of Raniere's power. Followers were encouraged to invest significant sums in NXIVM courses, workshops, and personal coaching sessions, often at great personal cost. Raniere and his inner circle amassed wealth through these programs while followers incurred debt, sacrificed career opportunities, and dedicated immense personal resources to the organization. Obedience and financial sacrifice were framed as moral or spiritual imperatives, making it psychologically difficult for members to question his authority. Raniere's influence extended to manipulating identity and self-perception. Women in DOS were often told that their worth and spiritual progress depended entirely on Raniere's evaluation. They were trained to internalize guilt, fear, and dependency, creating a system of psychological domination that reinforced his control. Former members described being isolated, emotionally manipulated, and coerced into believing that defiance or resistance would result in personal or spiritual harm. Raniere's methods combined elements of cultic indoctrination, coercive control, and sexual predation in a highly systematic manner. The criminal investigation into Raniere's activities began after numerous former members spoke out about abuse, exploitation, and illegal practices. Law enforcement uncovered evidence of forced labor, sexual exploitation, identity theft, and racketeering. In 2018, Raniere was arrested and charged with a series of crimes including sex trafficking, forced labor, and conspiracy. The trial revealed the meticulous and coercive methods he had employed to control followers and maintain secrecy. Survivors testified about the psychological manipulation, abuse, and trauma they endured, painting a picture of a man who weaponized trust, ambition, and belief for personal gain. In 2020, Raniere was convicted on multiple counts, including sex trafficking, forced labor conspiracy, and racketeering. The verdict was the culmination of years of investigation, survivor testimonies, and documentation of his manipulative control. He was sentenced to 120 years in prison, ensuring that the full extent of his criminality would be met with legal accountability. The aftermath of Raniere's crimes has been profound. Survivors continue to process trauma, rebuild their lives, and seek justice for the exploitation and manipulation they suffered. NXIVM's existence serves as a cautionary tale about the modern evolution of cult dynamics, particularly in the context of self-help, professional ambition, and intellectual seduction. Raniere's story highlights how charisma, intelligence, and a veneer of legitimacy can be weaponized to manipulate, exploit, and abuse trust in contemporary society. Raniere's life and crimes demonstrate the lethal combination of charm, ideology, and psychological manipulation. By presenting himself as a mentor and visionary, he drew followers into a system where obedience, secrecy, and submission became pathways to exploitation. The story of Keith Raniere is a chilling reminder of how easily faith, ambition, and trust can be exploited by a manipulative figure. with devastating personal and legal consequences. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. Allison Mack, once known as a television actress with a rising career, became a central figure in one of the most infamous modern cult scandals. NXIVM, born in 1982 in Germany and raised in California, Mack's early life seemed ordinary, marked by schooling, acting ambitions, and eventual fame for her role on a popular television series. But behind the public persona, Mack would become deeply involved in the inner workings of NXIVM, the self-help organization led by Raniere, eventually facilitating and participating in criminal activity that shocked the world. Mack joined NXIVM in the mid-2000s, drawn by promises of personal growth, empowerment, and professional development. Initially presented as a legitimate self-improvement group, NXIVM offered workshops, seminars, and courses designed to enhance leadership skills, confidence, and emotional awareness. Mack, like many others, was attracted to the structure, the sense of community, and the appearance of mentoring under a visionary leader. Raniere's charisma and persuasive ability quickly drew her into the organization's most secretive inner circle. Once entrenched in NXIVM, Mack became a close associate of Raniere, helping to recruit, indoctrinate, and control followers, particularly women. She assumed a position of authority within the secret subgroup known as DOS, which Raniere framed as a women's empowerment society, but which operated under strict control, coercion, and exploitation. Members were required to provide compromising personal information, known as collateral, and adhere to strict obedience to Mack and Raniere. Failure to comply could result in public shaming, blackmail, or ostracization. The psychological manipulation in DOS was extreme. Women were taught to internalize guilt, fear, and loyalty to the organization above their own judgment or safety. Mack's role was particularly insidious because she leveraged trust and authority to coerce women into actions they might not have undertaken on their own. She recruited new members, instructed them on rules of secrecy, and supervised rituals that included branding with Raniere's initials, strict diet regimens, and sexualized obedience. She presented these practices as rites of empowerment and spiritual growth, masking abuse and coercion under the guise of mentorship. For many members, Mack was both a trusted guide and a feared authority figure, embodying the duality of support and control that is a hallmark of cult dynamics. The criminal elements of Mack's involvement became clear. During law enforcement investigations into NXIVM, authorities uncovered evidence of sex trafficking, forced labor, identity coercion, and psychological manipulation orchestrated by Raniere, with Mack as a primary facilitator. She used her celebrity status to attract recruits and lend legitimacy to the organization, ensuring compliance and silence among followers. Many women reported feeling trapped, fearful, and powerless, believing that leaving the group or defying Mack would bring personal, spiritual, or even legal consequences. In 2018, Mack was arrested alongside Raniere and others connected to NXIVM. Federal prosecutors charged her with conspiracy, identity theft, and sex trafficking, citing her role in recruiting women, maintaining secrecy, and enforcing Raniere's authority. Court records and survivor testimonies detailed the psychological manipulation, sexual coercion, and exploitation that Mack had facilitated, highlighting her active participation in criminal activity. She pled guilty to racketeering charges in 2019, acknowledging her role in the operation of DOS and the coercion of women under the guise of empowerment. Mack's sentencing included imprisonment, probation, and restitution, reflecting both her involvement and her cooperation with authorities in the broader investigation. The fallout from Mack's actions has been profound. Survivors of NXIVM continue to grapple with trauma, manipulation, and the psychological scars of coercion. Mack's story serves as a cautionary tale about the role of intermediaries in cult dynamics, individuals who are not the primary leader, but who enforce, facilitate, and amplify the leader's control. It highlights how trust, admiration, and authority can be weaponized to manipulate vulnerable individuals and sustain abusive systems. Mack's life demonstrates how charisma, fame, and intelligence can be redirected into harmful ends when aligned with manipulative ideology and absolute authority. Her transformation from actress to enforcer within a criminal cult underscores the dangers of unchecked power and blind loyalty. It also illustrates the psychological mechanisms that allow ordinary individuals to participate in exploitation, coercion, and criminal acts under the influence of a dominant, charismatic leader. When someone in a position of trust becomes the enforcer of manipulation and control, devotion is twisted into complicity. Allison Mack's story reminds us that criminality in cults is not only the work of the leader, it often depends on facilitators who convert loyalty into coercion, creating systems where abuse and exploitation are perpetuated under the guise of guidance, mentorship, or empowerment. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. Joseph D. Mambro, born in 1924 in Italy, became the enigmatic and controlling leader of the Order of the Solar Temple, a secretive, esoteric society that spanned Europe and North America. Initially a businessman with interests in finance and the occult, D. Mambro developed a fascination with mysticism, secret societies, and apocalyptic prophecy. Over time, he combined these interests with a magnetic charisma and an ability to manipulate the spiritually curious, forming a cult that would ultimately be associated with murder, mass suicide, and financial exploitation. D. Mambro's public persona was one of sophistication, intellectual depth, and spiritual insight. He presented himself as a master of esoteric knowledge and a guide for those seeking enlightenment, immortality, and transcendence. Followers were drawn to the promise of exclusive wisdom, personal transformation, and participation in a secretive, powerful network. Many were affluent or well-educated Europeans, captivated by the allure of belonging to a movement that claimed ancient spiritual authority and access to hidden knowledge. Under D. Mambro's leadership, the Order of the Solar Temple operated with strict hierarchy, ritual, and psychological control. Members were expected to surrender personal autonomy, wealth, and social ties to demonstrate loyalty. He dictated behavior, isolated followers from outside influence, and used fear, promises of spiritual reward, and social pressure to maintain absolute control. Women were often subjected to sexual coercion under the guise of mystical initiation or spiritual duty, while men were indoctrinated to accept hierarchy and unquestioning obedience. The cult cultivated a sense of inevitability about its apocalyptic prophecies, compelling followers to internalize loyalty as both moral and existential obligation. Financial exploitation was central to D. Mambro's power. Followers were encouraged to donate large sums, transfer property, and contribute personal wealth to the organization. These resources sustained the cult, financed D. Mambro's lifestyle, and reinforced dependence, ensuring that members remained committed and invested. Members who hesitated were often threatened with spiritual consequences, isolation, or public shame, ensuring that obedience was maintained through both fear and indoctrination. Criminal activity escalated with the cult's focus on apocalyptic prophecy and the promise of transcendence. D. Mambro convinced followers that death could be a gateway to a higher spiritual existence, framing mass suicide as an act of ultimate devotion and enlightenment. Beginning in the 1990s, several tragic events unfolded across France, Switzerland, and Canada. Dozens of cult members died in coordinated ritualistic suicides and murders, often staged to resemble religious ascension. Many were drugged, bound, or coerced, highlighting the chilling level of manipulation exercised by D. Mambro and his inner circle. Investigations revealed that some deaths were murders disguised as suicides, orchestrated to ensure compliance and fulfill the cult's apocalyptic narrative. Authorities were initially hampered by the secretive nature of the order. Rituals were conducted in isolated locations, and communication was heavily controlled. It was only after bodies were discovered in remote areas of Switzerland and France that law enforcement could piece together the horrifying scope of the crimes. Investigations uncovered diaries, recordings, and documents detailing the cult's rituals, financial transactions, and D. Mambro's control mechanisms. These materials demonstrated the psychological manipulation, coercion, and deliberate orchestration of death that underpinned the cult's operations. The media coverage of the Solar Temple's crimes created widespread shock across Europe. Families were devastated, struggling to reconcile the deaths of loved ones with the reality of manipulation and coercion. Survivors recounted years of psychological control, exploitation, and fear, describing life under D. Mambro as a constant balancing act between obedience and dread. Scholars and psychologists analyzed the case as an example of how cult dynamics, apocalyptic belief, and authoritarian control can converge to produce mass criminality. Mambro himself died in 1994 during one of the mass death events in Switzerland, alongside key followers, solidifying the tragic and criminal legacy of the Order of the Solar Temple. The aftermath left lasting scars. Communities grappled with the shocking scale of the tragedy. Survivors struggled to rebuild their lives, and authorities implemented stricter oversight of secretive organizations that claimed religious or spiritual authority. Joseph D. Mambro's story exemplifies the lethal combination of charisma, ideology, and absolute control. By convincing followers that ultimate obedience, financial sacrifice, and even death were spiritual imperatives, he transformed devotion into criminally orchestrated tragedy. The Solar Temple case demonstrates the extreme danger posed when authority is unchecked. Ideology becomes weaponized, and trust is exploited to justify murder and suicide. When belief in transcendence is manipulated by a leader who cloaks control in mysticism, obedience can become fatal. Joseph D. Mambro's life and crimes remind us that even sophisticated, educated individuals can fall prey to coercion, and that faith, when exploited, can be transformed into a vehicle for manipulation, abuse, and mass death. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. Luc Jouret, born in 1947 in Belgium, became a central and chilling figure in the European cult known as the Order of the Solar Temple. Unlike other charismatic leaders who operated primarily through ideology or religion, Jouret combined mysticism, ceremonial grandeur, and psychological manipulation to craft an image of spiritual authority and transcendence. A physician by training, Jouret cultivated an aura of intellectual sophistication and occult knowledge, which he leveraged to attract affluent and educated followers seeking enlightenment, power, and belonging. Jouret's rise to prominence began in the late 1970s and 1980s, when he traveled extensively, studying esoteric traditions, New Age philosophies, and secret societies. He was fascinated by the notion of spiritual evolution, immortality, and the idea that human consciousness could ascend to a higher plane. Jouret framed himself as the guide who could lead devoted followers to this transcendence, blending ceremonial rituals with promises of mystical insight. His charisma, combined with intellectual authority, made him a compelling figure to those seeking purpose and spiritual elevation in an increasingly materialistic world. By the late 1980s, Jouret had joined forces with Joseph D. Mambro in France, merging his charismatic leadership with D. Mambro's financial and organizational control. Together, they expanded the Order of the Solar Temple across Europe, presenting it as a secretive society devoted to spiritual ascension, ancient wisdom, and elite enlightenment. Followers were drawn by the promise of participation in a select, spiritually advanced community, with access to mystical teachings and a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. Under Jouret's direction, members were subjected to strict psychological control. Obedience, secrecy, and devotion were reinforced through rituals, hierarchical supervision, and the inculcation of fear. The leaders convinced followers that death was not an end but a gateway to a higher plane of existence, framing suicide and ritualistic killing as acts of ultimate devotion. Women and men alike were manipulated through isolation, ideological indoctrination, and the careful cultivation of dependence, ensuring that descent or escape was nearly impossible. Jouret's crimes culminated in the early 1990s, when he orchestrated a series of ritualistic deaths across France and Switzerland. Dozens of members died in fires, shootings, and drug-induced suicides, all carefully staged to align with the cult's apocalyptic narrative. Investigations revealed that Jouret, along with D. Mambro, had meticulously planned these events to ensure both compliance and secrecy. Followers were often misled, sedated, or coerced into participation, highlighting the extreme psychological manipulation that had permeated the organization for years. Financial exploitation was also central to Jouret's control. Members were expected to donate significant sums, surrender property, and provide labor to maintain the order's operations. Wealth was concentrated among the leaders, reinforcing both material dependence and loyalty. Jouret's combination of spiritual authority and financial leverage allowed him to maintain dominance over followers while cultivating an outward image of enlightenment and benevolence. Media exposure and law enforcement investigations after the mass deaths revealed the full scope of Jouret's manipulation. Survivor testimonies described years of fear, coercion, and indoctrination. Many spoke of the gradual erosion of autonomy, the cultivation of absolute loyalty, and the terror of being unable to escape. Psychological analyses highlighted the ways Jouret and Mambro exploited human trust, devotion, and the desire for spiritual meaning to orchestrate criminal acts on a massive scale. Jouret himself died in 1994 during one of the coordinated mass death events in Switzerland, alongside several key followers. His death, like those of other members, was staged as a transcendental passage rather than a crime, reflecting the cult's ability to manipulate perception, ideology, and obedience. The aftermath left survivors traumatized, families grieving, and communities grappling with the shock of mass murder disguised as spiritual ascension. Luc Jouret's story demonstrates the devastating consequences of combining intellect, charisma, and spiritual authority with coercive control. By convincing followers that ultimate devotion required the surrender of autonomy and even life itself, he transformed faith into a vehicle for criminal acts, exploitation, and mass tragedy. His leadership underscores how spiritual or esoteric authority, when wielded without accountability, can become a tool for abuse, coercion, and death. When spiritual authority is merged with charisma and manipulation, devotion can become fatal. Luc Jouret's life reminds us that even educated, discerning individuals can be ensnared by the promise of transcendence, and that blind obedience to a leader claiming higher truth can lead to unimaginable tragedy. What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. Thousands of worshippers who filled the massive sanctuary of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church every Sunday morning. Their leader, Eddie Long, was more than a pastor. He was a symbol of spiritual authority, a man who claimed that God rewarded obedient faith with abundance, financial, emotional, and spiritual. And Eddie lived that message louder than anyone. Luxury cars, $3,000 suits, diamond cufflinks, all presented without apology. To Eddie, these weren't signs of greed. They were signs of blessing. But beneath the image of success, beneath the charismatic sermons, the booming choir, and the carefully polished persona, lived a darker reality. One that would eventually tear his empire apart and leave an entire congregation questioning every sermon they had ever believed. Eddie Long didn't begin as a celebrity pastor. He started quietly, with modest crowds and humble sermons. But from the moment he took over leadership at New Birth, in the late 1980s, things changed. Membership exploded, from a few hundred members to nearly 25,000. Politicians visited, celebrities visited, national faith networks featured him regularly. His message was simple: God rewards those who obey. And Eddie positioned himself as the living proof of that reward. But success came with scrutiny, and Eddie grew more controlling over his public image. Former staff members later said he ran the church like a corporation, and he stood at the center of every decision. Still, to his followers, he was the man who prayed with presidents, spoke with authority, and delivered fiery sermons that left people in tears. No one imagined what would happen next. In the early 2000s, Eddie began surrounding himself with a group of teenage boys, young, impressionable, often from unstable homes. He called them spiritual sons. He bought them expensive gifts, cars, clothes, jewelry, even luxurious trips. Some church members raised questions. Why so much attention? Why only boys? Why the secrecy? But Eddie's charisma and power made questions feel dangerous. Staff members who pushed too far found themselves suddenly reassigned or unemployed. The whispers grew louder, but no one dared speak publicly. Not yet. In 2010, 4 young men stepped forward, and the world changed overnight. They accused Eddie Long of using his spiritual authority to coerce them into sexual relationships while they were teenagers. The lawsuits were explosive, detailed, chilling. The plaintiff's attorney described evidence of explicit messages, late-night hotel stays, gifts exchanged for silence, trips paid for with church funds. Eddie Long, the man who built an empire preaching purity, was accused of betraying the very youth he claimed to mentor. The story dominated national headlines. Satellite trucks surrounded the church. Members were torn between loyalty and horror. Eddie denied everything, famously declaring, "I am not a perfect man, but I am not the man being portrayed in these allegations." But he never stood trial. Instead, he settled privately with all 4 young men. The amount was never publicly confirmed, but reports estimated the settlement reached into the millions. To many, the settlement felt like confirmation. To others, it felt like betrayal. The aftermath was devastating. Families who had worshipped together for decades suddenly found themselves divided. Some said Eddie was being targeted for his influence. Others felt they had been spiritually manipulated by a man living a double life. Attendance at New Birth dropped sharply. Media networks once eager for Eddie's sermons now turned away. His reputation, once seemingly untouchable, was in ruins. Yet even then, many supporters refused to leave him. That loyalty raised difficult questions. How deeply can a spiritual leader embed themselves into people's lives? And what happens when that trust breaks? In 2016, Eddie appeared on stage looking shockingly thin. The once imposing figure had wasted away. He claimed he was on a vegan health journey, but within months, the truth emerged. He was suffering from an aggressive form of cancer. Congregants watched their pastor decline rapidly. As he weakened physically, questions about accountability, responsibility, and truth resurfaced among former members and critics. In January 2017, Eddie Long died at the age of 63. The megachurch he left behind remained divided, its legacy forever shaped by both its explosive rise and its catastrophic fall. Eddie Long's story echoes a painful truth about power within religious institutions. When spiritual authority is combined with adoration, wealth, and unchecked influence, the line between guidance and control becomes dangerously thin. Eddie preached blessings, but some now wonder whether he used God's name as a shield for desires he kept hidden. His life leaves behind a question that lingers long after the final sermon. How do you protect faith from the people who claim to lead it? What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. To millions of Americans in the 1970s and 80s, Jim Bakker was the warm, friendly face of Christian television, a man who laughed easily, cried openly, and spoke about God with the charm of a seasoned performer. His empire, the PTL Club, was one of the largest religious broadcast networks in the world, and at the heart of its success was a promise. If you helped fund the ministry, God would bless you financially in return. But behind the television smiles, the upbeat choir music, and the tear-filled testimonies, Jim Bakker was constructing something unprecedented, a religious empire built on money, manipulation, and the unwavering trust of his followers. And like all empires built on deception, it would eventually crumble. Jim Bakker began as a traveling preacher with his wife, Tammy Faye Bakker. They were charismatic, entertaining, and unusually emotional for Christian broadcasts of their time. Tammy sang with extravagant makeup and tear-streaked cheeks. Jim preached about hope, prosperity, and the love of God. Viewers didn't see them as distant religious authorities. They saw them as family. As the PTL Club grew, donations flooded in. People sent checks, jewelry, family heirlooms, anything they believed could support God's work. Jim encouraged this generosity constantly, telling viewers that planting seeds into the ministry would lead to miracles in their own lives. And for many poor or struggling families, that promise felt like oxygen. The Bakkers lived extravagantly. Mansions, luxury cars, fine clothes, all funded by donations from people who often had very little. But Jim insisted none of it was greed. He said blessings were proof of God's favor, and the more he preached it, the more people believed it. Then came the project that would become the center of his downfall. Heritage USA. The idea was massive. A $200 million Christian theme park, complete with a hotel, water, cable television studios, and a Holy Land replica. Jim said it would be a place where families could find joy free from sin, and he encouraged viewers to donate to help build it. He sold lifetime partnerships, expensive memberships that guaranteed annual lodging at the resort. The problem was simple. Jim sold far more partnerships than the property could ever accommodate. Tens of thousands of people paid for yearly stays in rooms that didn't exist. And behind the scenes, PTL money was being siphoned off for personal use, hush payments, and lavish luxuries. The financial fraud alone could have destroyed the ministry. But the scandal that ultimately detonated everything was more personal. In 1987, it emerged that Jim Bakker had paid $279,000 to silence a young church secretary named Jessica Hahn. She said Jim had coerced her into a sexual encounter, something Jim denied, claiming it was consensual. But the revelation of the secret payout sent shockwaves across the religious world. The news broke during a time when televangelists were seen as untouchable spiritual giants. For millions of viewers, Jim Bakker was a man who cried during prayers and preached against sin. Now he was being accused of sexual misconduct and covering it up with donor funds. As investigations began, the financial fraud surrounding Heritage USA unraveled rapidly. Federal auditors discovered that PTL leaders had diverted millions of dollars for personal use. One investigator later described the ministry as a corporation disguised as a church, with no internal controls and unlimited money. Supporters watched in disbelief as footage aired of Jim and Tammy living in gold-plated luxury, while elderly donors wept about giving away retirement savings to support the ministry. In 1988, Jim Bakker was arrested. He was charged with 24 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and mail fraud. Prosecutors said he had swindled followers out of more than $150 million. One government witness said the Bakkers treated donations like personal piggy banks. During the trial, the prosecution presented evidence of fabricated financial reports, false promises to donors, and lavish spending sprees that included gold-plated bathroom fixtures, expensive clothing, and private jets, all justified to donors as ministry needs. Jim Bakker wept on the stand. He said he never meant to deceive anyone, but the jury didn't believe him. He was convicted and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison. The PTL empire collapsed overnight. Heritage USA shut down. Thousands of believers felt abandoned and betrayed. Some said it was the greatest spiritual wound they had ever experienced, not because Jim sinned, but because he had done it while claiming to represent God. Tammy Faye filed for divorce. The IRS pursued years of unpaid taxes, and Jim, once one of the most powerful pastors in America, sat alone in a prison cell. But even then, the story didn't end. After serving 5 years, Jim Bakker was released early. Many expected him to disappear from public life, but he re-emerged quietly at first. Then, with growing boldness, he wrote a book claiming that God had forgiven him. Churches invited him to speak. Gradually, he rebuilt an audience. By the 2000s, he launched a new ministry, this time focused on apocalyptic prophecy. Instead of selling hotel memberships, he began selling survival buckets, end-times gear, and miracle cures, including products that later resulted in federal warnings and lawsuits. Critics said it was the same pattern repeating: fear, urgency, and profit, all in God's name. Supporters insisted he was a redeemed man, but for many who remembered the PTL collapse, the most haunting question was simple: how many times can a spiritual leader betray the trust of believers and still find people willing to follow? Jim Bakker's story remains one of the most devastating examples of how religious authority, unchecked and unaccountable, can turn faith into a marketplace and devotion into currency. It leaves behind a chilling reflection: when a pastor becomes a brand and God becomes a product, who pays the price? What part of this case shocked you the most? Let me know in the comments. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.